A recent Juniper report found 94% of respondents said they're moderately or very reliant on their AI systems to assist in decision-making. But at the same time, a mere 9% have put policies and procedures in place, like establishing a company-wide AI leader to ensure responsible AI growth. That's a big gap in governance. Bob Friday, Juniper's Chief AI Officer and co-founder of Mist Systems, that's at the very heart of Juniper's own AI portfolio, is with us to share why this could be a problem and how you can get ahead of it. So Bob, what's the biggest risk for companies that don't work to establish AI governance?
Yeah, and Jessica, I would say there's probably three big areas I would tell businesses and companies to take a look at in the context of AI. The first one is around ESG. This is really with your investors and your customers. Are we going to start to see our investors and our customers requiring AI principles and guidelines in their RFP? So that's one big risk area they need to take a look at. The second is just around regulations. What we're seeing in Europe right now, we're starting to see the first of AI regulations really around defining, AI apps that do with safety. This is medical, cancer prediction, autonomous driving, that they're starting to put regulation on these apps that, companies and businesses need to be aware of. In the US, we're starting to see it much more distributed. Each FDA, each department in the US is starting to create their own framework. So that's a risk area that companies need to keep an eye on. And finally, another interesting one is really around data violation. Similar to open source, where if you put IP in your product or open source rights to, if you acquire companies that are using AI, you need to really make sure that they have the right to use the data they use to train those models.
If you had one piece of advice for companies balancing AI growth versus governance, what would it be?
I'd say I'd give them two pieces of advice. One would be, first of all, do an internal audit, both external and internal for both of your product, or using AI in your product. And even more importantly, internally, are you starting to see AI tools in HR be bought, right? Make sure that, people who are actually using these AI tools understands the responsibilities, and make sure they're not, unwittingly creating unfairness or bias somewhere in the business.
Sometimes governance policies can hinder growth. Can focusing on AI governance actually lead to growth?
Well, there's actually AI governance you actually need inside your, product teams, and this is really around if you're doing ML, machine learning models, you need to make sure you actually have governance in place to actually look for data drift, because you'll see drift even across the clouds, because you'll have different customer bases. If you're operating on the Google cloud versus the Amazon or Azure cloud, you may find that the model you train for the Google cloud is slightly different than your customer base on your Amazon cloud. So that's cases where, actually having governance in place will actually help build a better product and help accelerate product. And I think the other thing we talked about risk is, as we start to see AI principles become more of an ESG discussion, if you don't have these things in place, you'll start to see investors asking for them, or you'll start to see these requirements pop up in your RFPs.
Great. Well, Bob, thanks for sharing your insights on how companies can responsibly get ahead with AI. To learn more, we've included a link to some Juniper AI resources and Bob's blog below. And while you're on the feed, take some time to soak up some more industry news and knowledge.